All right, everyone. Hello, my fellow Earth dwellers. Thank you for coming. Today is a Separation of Church and State Day. I'm sure you knew that. It's also Free Thought Month, and we are also winding down on International Augmentative and Alternative Communication Awareness Month. I don't know, say that 3 times fast. I honestly don't know where I get these things or why I do this. To say it tickles me, and I'm also severely lacking in adult supervision. But welcome, one and all, to Skeptical Inquirer Presents. This is a series of live online presentations from experts who are devoted to advancing science over pseudoscience, media literacy over conspiracy theories, and critical thinking over magical thinking. My name is Leanne Lord, and I am delighted, as always, to be your host. I am a stand-up comedian and author, and also a co-host for Point of Inquiry podcast. The latest episode is Science Denial, Why It Happens, and What to Do About It. It's available wherever you get your podcasts. And if you haven't already, you know what I'm going to say. Get yourself a subscription to Skeptical Inquirer magazine. The print subscription gives you access to the digital subscription, which I believe is more bang for your intellectual buck. And you can get either or both at skepticalinquirer.org. Now, quick word to the wise here. Please mark your calendar for the next Skeptical Inquirer Presents. On November 11th, we've got something very special for you. I dare say magical. David Copperfield, his new book, David Copperfield's History of Magic, has come out, and we'll have him along with Richard Wiseman. Yes, experimental psychologist and author of 59 Seconds, Richard Wiseman. That one here on Thursday, November 11th. And to talk about what? That's right, the history of magic. It's going to be great. Now, if this is your first time here with us, let me explain how this all works. The flow of the evening is very, very easy. You're already doing your part beautifully, by the way. You're here. I'll introduce our guest. They'll razzle and dazzle. And after which we will open it up for your questions. And you'll see at the bottom of your screen there's an icon that says Q&A, and that is the place for you to type your questions in the form of a question if you can. I already know this is a high IQ group. I don't need your CV. You don't need standing. Just ask your questions. And if you miss any of the talk tonight, it is being recorded and will be available on skepticalinquirer.org. Now, many people believe that science is in crisis. But our guest tonight says that the scientific enterprise in America is alive and well and thriving. But she also acknowledges that some Americans have actively resisted or even denied the legitimacy of scientific guidance. She has been researching the social and psychological drivers of public skepticism about science. So we're very lucky to have her here on Skeptical Inquirer Presents. She's perfect for this show. She is an internationally renowned earth scientist and historian. She is a professor at Harvard University. She is a Guggenheim Fellow and was awarded the British Academy Medal for her commitment to documenting the role of corporations in distorting scientific findings for political ends. Shocking. She's the author of Why Trust Science, and her 2004 essay, The Scientific Consensus on Climate Change, I'm sure you guys know this, has been widely cited, including in the Academy Award-winning film, An Inconvenient Truth. Her 2010 book with Eric Conway, Merchants of Doubt, has been translated into 9 languages and sold over 100,000 copies and made into a documentary film. Her new book with Eric, The Big Myth, How American Business Taught Us to Loathe Government and Love the Free Market. It will be out in 2022. She is a busy woman. And so our guest is posing and hopefully answering the question tonight, can science be saved? And so without further ado, please welcome Naomi Oreskes. Naomi, you have the con.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be with you. And thank you for that wonderful and fun and upbeat introduction. I don't often get described as perfect, so I'll take it. Well, it is really a pleasure to be with everyone here today. And I know that people probably have a lot of questions. I know my audiences always have a lot on their mind. So I'm going to try to keep the talk tonight relatively short. I cut out some slides, so I hope it's only going to be about half an hour, and that will leave us lots of times for question and discussion. So my title tonight, as you heard from Leanne, is Can Science Be Saved? And so the spoiler alert is, actually, I want to argue tonight that science doesn't need to be saved. As Leanne already suggested, I think the scientific enterprise in America is alive, it's well, and it's thriving. But we do have some issues we need to address, and we can't address them properly if we misdiagnose them. So a lot of what I want to do tonight is to show how science is working well, but also to explain what we've learned from our research about some of the areas in which people actively reject science. So how can I say science is doing well? Well, just consider the events of the last year. First of all, when a new disease appeared in China, oh, sorry, things are, there we go. I just need to, there's some weird things on my screen. There we go. Okay, that's better. In just a few weeks, scientists were able to identify this new virus that was causing the COVID-19 illness, and they did this by sequencing its DNA. That is something that we talk about all the time now as a completely casual thing, but when many of us were children, that was a science-based technology that did not exist. Today, we take it for granted and we use it for many things. But the scientists didn't just identify the disease, they also developed an effective vaccination. In under a year, scientists produced not one, but several vaccines with an absolutely astonishing levels of efficacy. So we know the vaccines have had efficacies in the 90%. Even now, as efficacy begins to wane on some of them, it's still very, very high for most people. Most of us really don't need boosters. We can get them if it makes us feel better or if we're working in high-risk professions. But for most of us, these vaccines have now satisfactorily prevented us from death and severe illness. So I think these results show us that our scientific enterprise is working well. Now, this is, of course, just one example, but the point is that when we needed scientists to deal with a crisis, they did. And they did exactly what we needed them to do, figure out what the illness was and develop a vaccine for it. And all of this in less than a year, which is really astonishing when you think how long it took to develop, say, the smallpox vaccinations 100 years ago. But I want to go further and also argue that I think the claims of a general crisis of trust in science are actually, well, at least exaggerated, if not wrong. One thing I always like to do as a historian is to point out that often when we feel as if we're in a crisis, it's useful to remember that there have been many times in the past where other people have thought they were in a crisis too. And you can find many times in the history of science where people thought science was in a crisis for one reason or another. One of my favorite examples is this essay from Ludwig Fleck from the 1960s that has the title, Crisis in Science. Some of you may know Ludwig Fleck was a very famous sociologist of science and microbiologist who did some of the work that inspired Thomas Kuhn's famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. But if we look at data, if we look at what's actually going on today, we find that there has been a decline in trust in institutions since the 1970s. These are data from the General Social Survey going back to 1973. But actually, science has fared better than most other institutions. There have been large decreases in people's trust in banks and financial institutions, including a not very surprising drop after 2008, big decreases in people's trust in science, in Congress, and big decreases in people's trust in the media. But science has changed almost not at all. So the perception that something has happened in the last few years is not supported by the data. And in fact, the only institution that is trusted more than science is the military. And it's actually only, well, there was a spike around the early 1990s, clearly associated with the Iraq War. And then in recent years, a general increase in trust in the military. But science and the military are the two organizations that actually garner the most trust by the American people. If we ask people specifically about government funding of science and engineering, we find something pretty interesting and I think important. 71% of Americans say that government investments in basic scientific research pay off in the long run. I don't think that's what a lot of us would have guessed when we have this impression that science is constantly under attack, and especially the impression that people don't appreciate the value of basic research. But it turns out that actually most of us do. Moreover, if we ask, well, do you think that investments in engineering and technology pay off in the long run? The number is almost exactly the same. 72% strongly agree, 71% strongly agree about basic science. So Americans, by and large, support government investment in basic scientific research and in investment in engineering and technology. If we look outside the United States, we find something pretty interesting, that although numbers do vary in different countries, as you would expect, overall trust in science is very high. About, on average, 82% of people across the globe say they have a lot or at least some trust in scientists to do what is right. About at least half of people around the globe think it's important for their country to be a leader in scientific investments. And again, many people have a fairly high degree of trust in scientists as well as in the value of science. And as I think I've already talked about this, any claim that there's been some kind of crisis that has developed in the last few years is really not supported by the evidence. And I know this is a very evidence-based group. There's one other thing I also thought I would throw in sort of just for fun, especially because today, some of you know, Congress held hearings on climate, on disinformation from the fossil fuel industry. One of the things I often hear when I speak in public is people will say, well, why should I trust science? Because scientists are always getting it wrong. This is a line that I've heard a lot. You see it on social media. If I ask my interlocutor, well, what science exactly are you thinking of? I would say 9 times out of 10, they actually aren't thinking of any science. It's just an impression they have. If they are thinking about any science in particular, it might be nutrition. And I think many of us know that there are some good reasons why nutrition science has been problematic, particularly when we take into account the role of the food industry in promoting disinformation about things like sugar and fat. But I thought it would be fun to look at one example where scientists made predictions and we can say, well, did they get them wrong or not? So as many of you know, my special area of expertise is the history of earth science and particularly the history of climate science. So here's a graph from a forthcoming paper that I'm working on, in which this shows a set of projections that climate modelers made back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s of what was going to happen to mean global temperature as a result of increased greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So these gray lines represent the model predictions. The red line is what really happened in real life. And you can see that real life is tracking right smack in the middle of the models, with the one exception of this outlier model here. So virtually all of the models were spot on, they were correct. So we see that climate science has a strong track record of predictive success. But what's particularly fun about this graph is if you ask the question, well, who made these models? Which scientists was it who were making these models? The answer is ExxonMobil scientists. So we see that scientists have predicted climate change accurately. We see they've delivered effective vaccines. We see that in general, Americans have a high level of trust in science as compared with other institutions. So why do we have this impression that there's a crisis of trust in science? Or put in the vernacular, what the heck is going on? Well, I think one answer to this question is the media narrative. For quite a few years now, we've seen articles asserting a crisis in trust in science. In fact, asserting that the crisis is so bad that the very survival of science is at stake. Now, interestingly, all of these headlines are taken from science journals. So scientists themselves have promoted this narrative of a crisis of trust in science on shockingly little data. And this supports something I've said for a long time, is that when it comes to science itself, scientists are shockingly unscientific. If we want to understand what's going on in science and about science, we need to be scientific about it. And that means collecting evidence. And so that's what I do in my research, is to collect relevant evidence about what we know about the development of scientific knowledge and how and why people accept or reject it. Well, one thing we know is that there's tremendous political polarization, particularly in the United States, but not only, about how people view science. People who self-identify as on the left side of the political spectrum tend to trust scientists much more than people who identify with being on the right of the political spectrum. And if we ask the question about trust in the military, that flips. So if you look here, this first line is the United States. People who self-identify as being on the left, 62% of them have a high level of trust in science, whereas those on the right, only 20%. So this is a 42-point difference. This is giant, right? Very few public opinion polls show differences this enormous. So there's a huge political polarization in how people view science and whether they think scientists are trustworthy. If we ask the military, it flips. Now we have 75% of people on the right trusting the military, only 35% of people on the left. So again, a big difference. And we see similar patterns in many other countries, Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom. Germany, the gap is less, but we still see it with respect to science. The only real exception is that all Germans distrust their military, and we probably can figure out why that is. So why are people rejecting science? And particularly, why would people on the right wing of the political spectrum reject science? I mean, science works for them as well as it works for people on the left. Vaccines don't care if you're Republican or Democratic. If you jump out a window, gravity is going to pull you down to earth. It's not going to matter whether you're Democrat, Republican, or independent. And yet we see these big differences in how Democrats and Republicans view science. So what our work points to is what I've called implicatory denial. People don't, in fact, generally, with some exceptions, but by and large, most people don't actually reject science across the board. Many Republicans have no problem with plate tectonics, or no problem with the idea that DNA carries hereditary information, or no problem with the idea that there are quarks, but they selectively reject science in specific areas because of either its real or perceived implication. The important thing to understand here is that this rejection is not because the science is weak, or that it's too uncertain, or that it's in some other way inadequate, but because the science implies, or they think it implies, something that they don't like, something that they don't like emotionally or intellectually. Now, if this analysis is correct, this is really important because it tells us that the problems cannot be solved with more science. That is to say, just giving people more facts will not change how they view it if their rejection is implicatory. And this, of course, is important because if we misdiagnose the problem, then our remedies are likely to fail. So there are three areas that are extremely well studied. And so tonight I'm going to focus on these three well-studied areas. One is evolutionary biology, another is climate change, and the third is the whole panoply of issues associated with COVID-19, focused on mask refusal and vaccine hesitancy. So many scientists think that the rejection of evolutionary theory is rampant, and that it's mostly driven by, quote, religious people who reject it because they think it conflicts with a literal reading of the Bible. Well, the evidence doesn't support that. First of all, it is true that a substantial number of Americans are skeptical about evolutionary theory, but it's also true that their responses are very sensitive to the nuances of wording. And whenever you have polling where the numbers change a lot, when you change how you ask the question, that's a sign that something at least a little bit nuanced is going on. So if you just give people two options, humans have evolved over time, or humans have existed in their present form since the beginning of time, so the one on the left obviously consistent with what scientists would say, the one on the right inconsistent, fully 31% of Americans choose the inconsistent option. So in other words, about a third of Americans reject evolutionary theory. But if you give them a three-option approach in which there's this middle ground in which humans have evolved, but maybe that process was maybe that process was guided by God or some other higher force, then the number who take the anti-scientific position reduces to only 18%. Now, we can argue about how to think about this middle ground where evolution occurs, but God guides it. Obviously, science can't tell us whether God did or didn't guide evolutionary theory. Scientists would say We don't need to invoke a supernatural power. And in science, we reject the idea of invoking supernatural powers. The whole point of science is to look for natural explanations. But still, nevertheless, what we see is that the clearly anti-scientific position is reduced to only 18%. So what this tells us is that something is going on that has to do not with evolutionary theory per se, or not with the fact of evolution per se, which actually, if we look at it this way, fully 81% of Americans are comfortable with the idea that humans have evolved, but it has to do with how we feel about the role of God in our lives, or the role at least of some other additional power. So I think these findings are consistent with many previous studies that suggest that most Americans do not reject science per se, and that evolution skepticism is not driven by literal readings of the Bible. These people are not saying that they think the earth was created in 6 days and men and women in one of those 6 days, but they are invoking views about the role of God in our lives. So what are some of the implications of evolutionary theory that lead people to be skeptical of it? Well, many people think that evolutionary theory tells us that there's no God, that life is random and therefore has no meaning, or as the former Pennsylvania Senator Rick Santorum put it, evolution makes humans into, quote, mistakes of nature. Well, if you think about it, none of these conclusions follow. So these perceived implications are actually not true. Science does not and cannot disprove the existence of God. Science does not tell us the meaning of life. And science does not tell us if people are mistakes. I mean, some people may be mistakes, but science isn't going to tell us that. The reason science can't answer these questions is because these are not scientific questions. They are philosophical, metaphysical, and theological. That is to say, they're outside the domain of scientific research. And so these misconceptions arise from a mistaken conception of what scientific theories can and cannot do. Now, admittedly, this misconception has been perpetuated by some scientists. I won't name names, but I think you know who they are. But the good news here is that there's a remedy. And so work that's been done by scholars at Arizona State University, the National Center for Science Education, and other places show that we can actually get around students' resistance to learning evolutionary theory by acknowledging the relevant intellectual distinctions, by acknowledging that the existence of God is not a scientific question. Evolutionary theory does not take a position on theological matters. Some scientists believe in God, some do not. Research also shows that you can reduce student resistance by assigning readings to students written by scientists who are also people of faith. The late Sir John Houghton, Francis Collins of the NIH, Ken Miller, the Brown University biologist, Catherine Hayhoe, the evangelical climate scientist. By showing students examples of scientists who do science and love science and are committed to science and are also people of faith, it helps break down some of the assumptions that they make about the conflict of science and religion. And so student resistance to learning about and accepting evolutionary theory can be reduced. In other words, we can address implicatory denial by showing there are other ways to interpret the alleged implication. And note that this is very different from just giving people more facts about evolution or refuting a particular creationist argument. For example, the infamous argument about the evolution of the eye. If you argue the details of evolution, you're actually missing the point. You're not addressing what the person's concern is. But if you distinguish between physical and metaphysical, or scientific and theological explanations, this does get at the point. So let's talk next about climate change, the area that I have worked on the most. So just as many scientists have a misapprehension about what drives evolutionary theory rejection, many scientists also have a misperception of what drives climate change denial. Many scientists think that climate change denial is driven by uncertainty, that the science is too uncertain, and that's why people are not convinced. And so I have heard many scientists over the years say things like, well, if only we could narrow the error bars. And we know that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has spent huge amounts of effort trying to reduce the uncertainties around their projections. But as an evolution, this actually misdiagnoses the problem. So once again, if we look at political affiliation in respect to how people think about climate change, we again find huge political polarization. Today, 88% of Democrats or people who lean Democratic are very concerned about climate change and believe that it is a major threat to the well-being of the United States, but only 31% of Republicans and people who lean Republican. So again, this is telling us that there's something going on that isn't just about the scientific facts. In fact, these patterns with respect to climate change reflect a broader pattern of polarization between Democrats and Republicans on voting and environmental issues in general that tracks back to the year 1990. Up until 1990, there were differences between how Democrats and Republicans thought about environmental issues, but those differences escalated, became a giant gulf, so that today in Congress, only about 10% of Republican votes ever support climate or environmental related voting, and only about 10% of Democrats don't. And note the important thing here, 1995 is the year that the IPCC first said the balance of evidence suggested a discernible human impact on the climate system. 1988, over here, is where Jim Hansen testified in Congress that climate science was underway. And during this period of time, the uncertainty about climate science has decreased dramatically, but the polarization has increased equally dramatically. So decreasing the uncertainty didn't persuade Republicans to accept climate science. So what's going on here? Well, climate change denial is complicated. There's more than one factor involved, but in our book, Merchants of Doubt, Eric Conway and I showed that a big factor, a motivating factor, particularly for some of the most vocal climate change deniers, was ideological. It was the ideology of market fundamentalism and the belief, worry, fear, anxiety, whatever word you like best, that government action to address climate change would compromise our personal freedom. And this was rooted in turn in Cold War anxieties about containing communism and the fear that government regulation of business was a backdoor to communism. These early climate change deniers, called environmentalists watermelons, green on the outside, but red on the inside. And by the way, in today's congressional hearings, we heard this happen again. We heard Republicans accusing climate advocates of being socialists. So this red baiting aspect is still with us today. And we know that this was also supported financially by the fossil fuel industry, but it wasn't only driven by the quest for profits, it was also driven by this ideological framework. And so the Republican alignment with climate change denial is linked to the Republican resistance to regulation of the marketplace. So how do we address this? Well, finding the answer is trickier than in the case of evolutionary biology, because in this case, some of the implications are sort of true, partially at least. Climate change is a market failure. The free market, in its idealized sense, has not figured out a solution to this problem. And in this sense, climate science really does challenge the conservative belief in free markets. So the perceived implications aren't entirely wrong. Nick Stern, the former chief economist of the World Bank, has called anthropogenic global warming the greatest and widest ranging market failure ever seen. And market failures require exogenous solutions. That is to say, governments have to do something to correct the market failure. You can't just wait for the market to fix itself, because by definition, that won't happen, because if it happened, then it wouldn't be a market failure. But what you can do is point out that these government solutions don't necessarily have to be big government solutions. In addition, climate change denial is also a kind of misdirection, because the reality is that the fossil fuel industry is not a free market. People who think they're defending the free market by denying climate change have got that wrong. Fossil fuels are heavily subsidized. In fact, the IMF has concluded that the fossil fuel industry is the second most heavily subsidized industry in the world. The only thing more subsidized is agriculture. There's a lot of argument about what the right numbers are, depending on how you define subsidies. I should update this slide, but a really great paper that came out just this year that was published in Environmental Research Letters about the impact of subsidies on fossil fuel profits, estimates that direct subsidies in the United States are at least $20 billion every single year. When we take into account the indirect subsidies, like the public health impacts and climate change, then the handout could be as high as 650 billion. And globally, I have an update on this. So 2015 was the last year for which IMF had done this. So as of 2015, they estimated that the world was spending 5 trillion on energy subsidies. That number is now up to 7 trillion. So the fossil fuel industry is trying to distract us from the realities of the cost of climate change and the reality of a colossal market failure. If you point this out to people, that the fossil fuel industry is basically trying to pull a fast one on us, well, what I've learned is that no one likes to be on the losing end of a con game. So let's turn now to COVID-19 and mask mandates. What is this all about? Well, again, we see the issue is highly polarized politically. Even more than evolutionary biology and climate change, mass rejection in the United States aligns with radical individualism, and a particular kind of radical individualism that characterizes a lot of conservative thinking in the United States, and the rejection of the notion of mandates in favor of personal freedom. And this tracks as well with a general hostility to what is often referred to as, quote, big government. So we don't have a lot of good data on this yet because it's still a relatively new thing. People haven't had time to really do the research and publish it in peer-reviewed journals. But if you look at the rallies that took place around the United States and Canada this year, what you saw that mass rejection was almost always being expressed as a defense of individualism and personal rights. Masks were accused of being or characterized as being a symbol of tyranny. And so standing up against masks was characterized as defiance of tyranny, standing up for freedom, and also as hostility to government. In all of this, what you see is a sentiment of people not wanting to be told what to do. As in this poster, I will not be mass tested, fracked, or poisoned. Sorry, tracked, not fracked. Now, to a lesser extent, we did see some evidence of mass rejection as an extension of science denial, people questioning the science, suggesting that masks didn't really work, but that was definitely a smaller component of the larger argument, which was about personal freedom. So in all of this, there is rejection of science. Oh, and I should just say one more thing. Since I put this talk together, a study just came out a couple of days ago that was written about in the New York Times, which was not so much about the masks, but about vaccines. So vaccine rejection is more complicated still. There is a very, very strong political alliance of vaccine hesitancy with conservative politics. So some of the same arguments about individual rights, suspicion of big government play out again. But it turns out that, and this has been evolving. I think it's different now than it was even 6 months ago. And this is, of course, always one of the challenges of social science research, that sometimes the things we're studying are changing even as we study them. But in the case of vaccine rejection, the single strongest correlation is lack of health insurance. So that also tells us that there are other important social factors that influence how people think about medicine or how people think. And it's not just about money, because if you have, because in most places vaccines are free. So, but it's something else about being estranged from the medical system when you don't have health insurance. Okay, so in all of this, we see there is rejection of science, to be sure, but it's not driven by a lack of trust in science, or much less by real problems in the science or real failures of science. It's driven by theological, political, ideological, and personal concerns and frameworks. So what does this mean for those of us who care about science, who believe in science, and who would like to see decision-making in America be more fact-based? Well, first of all, it's important to recognize that the vast majority of Americans do trust science. Most Americans are getting vaccinated. Most Americans are wearing masks. We may be annoyed by someone we see on the subway not wearing a mask, but the reality is that the majority of us are. So all of the available evidence suggests that for the vast majority of us who do trust science, facts do count. So we should not go around saying, oh, facts don't matter. Facts absolutely matter. And in my work with the National Center for Science Education, I've found, particularly for people like teachers who are desperate for good information, desperate to know how they can best explain science to their students and sometimes even to their students' parents. So it behooves all of us who are in or proximal to the scientific community to provide good quality information in formats that non-experts can understand. But for the minority who are motivated by non-empirical concerns, then our outreach has to recognize those concerns, particularly insofar as they may, at least in part, be valid. I mean, think about it. I don't really want the government telling me what to do either. I believe in freedom, but I only believe in freedom so long as it doesn't hurt the people around me. So for scientists, I think what this means is that as much as possible, we should try to communicate our findings without telling people what to do. And if people ask us what they should do, well, that's different. And then you can answer that, or you could give them options, or you could tell them, what the evidence supports about the efficacy of different kinds of interventions. But it's really about communicating findings and results and letting people, as much as possible, figure out for themselves what to do with that information. But also, and what is really important, and this also comes out of research and communication science, and I don't have time tonight to go into this in detail, but the really, really important take home is not to be afraid to talk about these issues. Many of us have pulled back from talking about these things because we don't want to get into a fight, we don't like confrontation, we don't want to ruin the Thanksgiving dinner. But studies show that when people share their concerns with friends, family, and colleagues, and when people communicate in a non-aggressive way, it helps. We're all influenced by what the people around us do. Sorry, there's a typo there. We're all influenced by what people around us do. So talking about why you care about climate change or why you got vaccinated can help. And I thought there was a beautiful example of this. So I wanted to end on a personal note here with a really beautiful example of this that I saw when I was in Provo, Utah last spring. So I was lucky enough to be able to get vaccinated in March of last year. And at the vaccination center in Provo, this is in Utah County, Utah, which is one of the most Republican counties in America, people were invited to post on the bulletin board, I got the COVID-19 vaccine today because. And this bulletin board was overflowing with incredibly beautiful things that people have said. And I thought this one was particularly lovely. I protect my family in many ways. Why not this? So again, it's not about giving people more facts, but it's about reminding people that we all care about our families and we all do all kinds of things to protect and support them. So why wouldn't we do this? Many of the answers were heartwarming fun. I miss my people. It's what superheroes would do. It's not crazy or stupid. Or this was my favorite. We're going to Cancun and we want to come home. Several expressed appreciation for science and for healthcare workers. Thank you for helping my mommy and daddy. And many of them reminded us that science and faith can live together. Thank you very much.
Naomi, thank you for that. That was, oh my goodness. I am changing my view here so I can look at more than just my face and see all that's wrong with it.
No,
thank you so much. There are a couple of things. We do have questions here. There are a couple of things that stood out to me. I was really surprised when you said that when polled the two things Americans do still trust are science and the military. Like,
right.
Yeah, that's not the impression at all. And you did go on to explain about the why that is, but in my head I started thinking one of the reasons is when you have any sort of blockbuster movie or TV show, the villains are either or both science or the military. Like consistently, those are the bad guys. The scientist is some weird dude who didn't get hugged as a child, or we have too many weapons. So that was what I thought of. I when I saw your chart and how the pivotal year was 1990, I thought, what, isn't that the year RoboCop came out? Does that have any effect on this at all? Probably not. Probably not.
We'll have to look into that. Look harder at what happened in 1990.
The RoboCop effect. I don't know.
Always think it's the end of the Cold War, but maybe it is RoboCop. I have to keep
know.
that hypothesis.
Yeah, we need more data. We need more
data for sure.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, people have said this in many ways, that scientists need to find ways to communicate their ideas a little bit better. And in my head, I'm seeing scientists, all running to TikTok to do little videos that'll get their point across in an entertaining way. But I do like what you said about, that they should state the findings, but not what to do, because nobody, apparently, especially Americans, like to be told what to do. And I'm thinking, hey, if you play with fire, your house is going to burn down. Do what you will. Like, exactly. The choice is yours. Exactly. The choice is always yours. But you did say something before we get to the questions. I do have a question about this, and some other folks might as well. You said one of the things that popped out was why people aren't wearing masks, or why they're fighting this, is a lack of health insurance. Can you explain that a little more? Because I find that surprising, especially since the vaccines are free. Like, what is that disconnect that they don't have insurance that leads to this possible outcome or this behavior?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and this is very new data. I just read this a couple of days ago, so I don't think we have really fully investigated yet, but I think this is just a really, really important example of when it comes to these kinds of questions, a lot of pundits, a lot of people are very quick to assert what it is before we actually have collected data. And this is why social scientific research is so important, because it is science, and we can collect data, and we can judge and evaluate hypotheses in social science the same way we can in natural science. And you probably know there was a lot of very careless stuff thrown out 6 months ago about the Tuskegee Experiments. And as a historian of science, I know a lot about the Tuskegee Experiments. And I remember thinking, wow, I don't think most Americans even know what the Tuskegee Experiments are. And the idea that—
well, maybe not most Americans, but certainly in my social circle.
No,
yeah,
some do, right. Some do, and it could be a factor for some. But again, how many? Is that really the dominant thing?
Right,
right. Right, the different people are going to be influenced by different things. And so it may be an important factor for some people in the African-American community, fair enough. But it turned out that actually, once we started collecting evidence, for more African-Americans, what really mattered was just getting a day off from work to be able to go get a shot, right? So again, the solution is very different, right? In the first case, you'd have to try to persuade them that, doctors are better nowadays, which I don't know, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. Right? That's questionable, but getting a day off from work, or 2 days if so the point is, it really matters knowing what the reason is, because the remedy will be different. So in the case of health insurance, I don't really know, but here's what I speculate. Okay. Here's my hypothesis. People who don't have health insurance are estranged from the medical system. It means they don't go to the doctor regularly. They don't have a doctor. They don't have someone in their lives who they trust, who they can turn to and say, well, hey, and it might not be a doctor, it might be a nurse practitioner. When I go to the doctor, it's often a nurse that I see, but I'm in conversation with the medical profession. But if you don't have health insurance and you don't go to the doctor because you can't afford it, then you are not just estranged from the people, but you're estranged from a flow of information. And you're estranged from having conversations with people who could reassure you and say, yeah, it doesn't hurt, or, maybe it'll hurt a little bit. You might feel crappy for a day or so. So I think that lack of social connection, we know that people make decisions a huge amount based on what the sociologists will call trusted messengers. If you don't have a trusted medical messenger in your life, well, then you may go to social media for your information. And we know that that is a cesspool.
Yeah. Oh, you're putting it very politely. That's nice. Thank you for keeping it clean for our audience.
Word.
Based off this question, I'm glad I just saw this. Charlene Blades, thank you for this. She asked if you could repeat the citation for vaccine denial and lack of health insurance. Did you state that?
No, I don't think I did. It was the New York Times.
Oh, okay.
A couple of days ago, and like I said, I didn't have time. It's been a busy couple of days here. I didn't have time to put a slide in on that. I can try to find it and send it to you afterwards, and maybe you can post it on the website or something like that. But it wasn't the New York Times. I want to say maybe 2 days ago. 2 or 3 days
Okay.
ago, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. And in case of folks in the audience don't know, we are really, really lucky to have Naomi here. She came off a media call right before doing this. Her knowledge and wisdom and information in this area is being called on. So we're lucky to be able to avail ourselves of it tonight. Jen wants to know the data you showed earlier was from 2017. And she was wondering how that's changed since 2020, or is that even in yet?
Yeah, I've had that question before, and the answer is too soon to tell. It's certainly possible that things have changed in the last couple of years, because of all the events surrounding COVID. We don't have good data on that yet, so the next round of the general social survey will definitely be important to look at.
Okay. And James, I hope you had a very similar question. I hope that answers it for you as well. James Hill wants to know, why is the spread of right and left leaning Germans so narrow with respect to their military?
Wait, the Germans? Oh,
yes, the Germans, our friends, the Germans. Weltschmerz is my favorite word.
I mean, I would assume that that's related to the history of the Nazi era, that most Germans, even today, even though it's, 70 years since the end of, or 75 years since the end of World War II, that a lot of Germans are still very nervous about the military and militarism, and think that it's really important that the military be kept in check. So I think in general, German citizens don't think it's a good idea to have a high level of trust in the military, even though they may think that individual military officers are perfectly fine people. So that would be my historical hypothesis. I'm not a German historian, but I think that's the obvious thing that sticks out that would make Germany different from many other countries.
Right. So Germany is actually afraid of something that has happened, whereas Americans are afraid of Avatar, the movie. And just so you know, our producer Mark Kreidler, he dropped this in the chat for everyone. They found an article about the recently discovered trend of uninsured and unvaccinated. So that is there for you guys if you want to check that out.
With Bloomberg News. Okay, good.
There we go. Yeah, no, we try to do it right here at Skeptical Inquirer Presents.
That's it. Yep.
Now, Richard Yeager brings up a point. He says that Jeffrey Cohen, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, argues that religion and science are fundamentally mutually exclusive. What's, again, I guess an opinion, what's in the future between science and religion? And is science really driving this wedge? I did not get the sense from what you have said that you do not think so, that is not the case, but I don't want to answer for you.
No, go ahead. I'm tired. No.
Well, everybody.
So here's what I think. Obviously, this is a complicated question, and there are zillions of books, hundreds, thousands of books that have been written about science and religion, both books insisting that science and religion are at war, books insisting that no, that it's all fine, we can all live in peace and harmony. My view is twofold. One is historical. So what we know historically is that despite a few very well publicized episodes like the Catholic Church prosecution of Galileo, that actually the church and science have coexisted well in Europe and North America for 400 years. And not only that if we go back to the early modern period, the church was an important patron of science. The Catholic Church, despite its mistake with Galileo, was the most important patron of astronomy in early modern Europe. Why? Because the church wanted to know the right date for Easter, and solar astronomy was used to figure that out. And there's a fabulous book on this called The Sun and the Church by John Heilbronn, who I highly recommend to anyone who is shocked by the idea of the church being an effective patron of science. We also know that in the 19th century, religious motivations drove a tremendous amount of scientific research in geology, in botany, in all the sciences that we think of as natural history, because scientists believed, like many others, that the heavens were telling the glory of God, that if you studied the natural world, you would come to know God through his work, that by studying nature, you were studying God's handicraft, and that there was no other better way to understand God. And sometimes people would talk about the book of Moses and the book of nature, the idea that there were two books that God had written, and that you could come to know God either by reading the Bible or by studying nature, or ideally by doing both. And so at Oxford and Cambridge and many other European universities, many of the dons were themselves ordained ministers, but they also taught geology, botany, zoology. So there's a long history of peaceful coexistence and even productive coexistence of science and religion. And yet somehow that doesn't get the headlines. The headline is conflict. And so this is, my journalist friends always say conflict makes copy. So we hear a lot about the conflict. We don't hear a lot about the peaceful coexistence. And then, as I've already said, if we actually look on the level of individual scientists, we find that many great scientists, both today and in the past, have been people of faith. My favorite example is Isaac Newton, because many people don't know that along with his research in physics, Newton wrote copious notebooks on religion. He was not conventionally religious for his day because he rejected the Trinity. He was a Unitarian, and he wrote long notebooks about why the Trinity, the notion of the Holy Trinity, was wrong, but Unitarianism was correct. So he has a strong religious view, but it's not anti-religious, and he doesn't see this as in any way, shape, or form at odds with his scientific work. And he's one of the greatest scientists that ever lived. And I could give you many, many other examples, but Newton is the most fun because it's Newton.
Right. I have to say, full disclosure, I am not religious. I was raised Catholic, so, damage done. But I'm not sure that I've heard anyone explain what you just did so beautifully. So I thank you for that. But your journalist friends are correct. I was a journalism major in school. You're right. That peaceful coexistence, that's not news, so we wouldn't know, or those wouldn't be the examples that you just gave that leap to mind. So what we're seeing right now on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, not really that new. We just keep repeating the cycle with the new technology that we have.
That's right. And since you said that you were raised Catholic, another example is our current Pope. If people in the audience have not already read it, the Papal Encyclical on Climate Change and Inequality is an absolutely beautiful piece of writing. The Pope did a lot of work to understand climate science. He invited scientists to the Vatican, of whom I was honored to be one. His staff and his team spent a lot of time trying to make sure that they understood the scientific facts, and then worked to put those facts into a Catholic theological framework. So whether you're a Catholic or not, whether you believe in God or not, it's an incredibly beautiful piece of work, and I highly recommend it. And shameless plug, I wrote the introduction to the Melville House Secular Edition, which we did in part because we wanted to make the point that this is a really important piece of work in writing and thinking, not just for Catholics, but for all people.
That's awesome. And all shameless plugs welcomed here.
Good. I'm liking the show more every minute. I've got 8 plug.
Oh, well, then we'll just have to go another hour and talk about each one of them. I'm kidding. Totally kidding. Andy Norman. Hey, Andy, thank you for showing up and supporting. He said, super talk, of course, and said, you wrote a book titled Merchants of Doubt. To what extent do you think science denial today is driven by the deliberate weaponization of doubt?
Yeah, a lot. And if you didn't watch, if you didn't watch the hearings of the House Oversight Committee, then I highly recommend you watch it, because it was, just an amazing display, rhetorically very deft display of the rhetorics of disinformation, denial, and doubt. And, a lot of talent goes into weaponizing doubt in this country, and it's very unfortunate. And it's unfortunate, in my opinion, that people who should know better, people who think of themselves as responsible, participate in this sort of thing, but they do, and it continues. And that's why we have to keep talking about it in order to expose it and hopefully defang it.
Thank you. I have a question from Bob Brandstrom, I think, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And we get this question in many forms, and almost at all of our presentations. And we've had several directly about this, but I'm going to ask anyway, just to get your take. He said, how do you think we can best communicate with people about how their choices impact everyone, not just themselves. Because you said a lot of this undergirding some of these protests are people who are defending their rugged individualism and this very uniquely American thing we have going on here. So how can we talk to these folks about how their choices affect others, not just themselves?
Yeah, this is a great question. Of course, like all communication, it's not a one size fits all answer. I mean, if you think about what is new on social media, it's the segmented advertising, right? That one of the things that social media has enabled marketers to do is to make very segmented messaging, because they know that messaging works best if you can hone it for the particular audience. So this means that if you're personally involved in messaging, you have to think somewhat about who your audience is, and that there isn't one answer that will work in all cases. But that said, the thing that I have found most effective is acknowledge and then talk. In other words, the most important thing to do is not to start talking at somebody, but first of all, to acknowledge and to see if there's some possible common ground. So for example, if you're at all sympathetic to the idea that you don't want the government to tell you what to do, or you don't want your taxes to be higher, or whatever it is that could be common ground with this person, you can begin by saying, yeah, I get it. I love being out alone in the wilderness, or I love hunting and fishing, or I just want to be left alone in my house to decide for myself. I get that, but your choices affect other people too. And if it was just about you, I mean, I always say, I'm known as a person who has said many highly critical things about the tobacco industry. But, I also have said, if smoking didn't hurt other people, then it wouldn't trouble me in the least. If people made the decision that they wanted to smoke, and if it meant that they got cancer, it's their decision, right? The problem is it doesn't just affect you. It affects your roommate, your partner, your children, and your children who can't decide for themselves, your bartender, your flight attendant. And, one of the critical legal cases that really shifted the conversation in the United States was a lawsuit brought by flight attendants. And there's a case of Norma Bruin et al. Versus Philip Morris. Norma Bruin was a flight attendant who'd got cancer. She was a Mormon and she did not smoke. She had never smoked a cigarette a day in her life, so far as her own testimony under oath said. And if she was an observant Mormon, then that's a highly credible claim. And she got lung cancer because of smoke that she inhaled in aircraft cabins. So,
wow.
Yeah. So, and of course, we know also children secondhand smoke. Here's a little known fact that always shocks me. Did you know that secondhand smoke causes sudden infant death syndrome?
No.
Yeah, I know. Isn't that insane that people don't know that?
I had never heard that.
Yeah, well, it's a fact. It does. And think about all the times, if you've had children, you know this, or if you have friends who have had children, you go to the doctor and they talk to you about spina bifida and Down syndrome. And if you're Jewish, Tay-Sachs, and if you're African-American, probably sickle cell anemia. I mean, I certainly heard that from doctors when I had my children. Not once, and no one I know has ever had a doctor tell them, and secondhand smoke causes sudden infant death syndrome.
Wow. I did not expect to learn that today. Why is it that we haven't heard this before? Why isn't that do doctors really, do they not know to share that information?
Yeah, I think a lot of doctors don't even know. So what happened was, when this information came out in the early 90s, it was considered so inflammatory that actually the Surgeon General decided to downplay it, because they felt it was such a bombshell that they wanted to be absolutely positively certain that it was true before they went public with it. And eventually the science came out that showed that it was absolutely positively true. But by then, people had sort of lost interest in the issue. So it never really got the attention it deserved. And I think a lot of physicians don't know themselves.
I do want to add to the person who asked that question, how do we talk to folks? I will refer you to the last episode of Skeptical Inquirer Presents. We had Lee McIntyre, who wrote a book called How to Talk to a Science Denier. And that episode is up on the website if you'd like to see it. And Naomi, I want to thank you for your time today, and for your presentation, and for sticking around to ask questions. And just like with Lee McIntyre's episode, I'll remind everyone that if you missed anything, the recording of this will be available sometime tomorrow on skepticalinquirer.org. And I want you to invite everyone back here again to join us on November 11th for David Copperfield and Richard Weissman. And as always, my thanks to Skeptical Inquirer and the Center for Inquiry, and for our producer, the most awesome producer in the whole world, Mark Kreidler, and of course to you, the audience. And my name is Leanne Lord. Thank you for joining us. Good night. Thanks again, Naomi. Have a
You're
wonderful
welcome.
evening.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.